10th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 0200 hours. Ludmila alighted on a merlin of Seagate's modest wall, right in front of a worried-looking sentry peering out into the night with an arrow nocked to his bow. Are they all normally so low-leveled, or were all of the higher-level sentries killed by the beastmen? Certain aspects of the beastmen invaders' behavior felt akin to the demi-human tribes that she was familiar with. One of her expectations coming into the Draconic Kingdom was that strong humans would be targeted because competition and conflict between demi-human tribes and their neighbors usually involved contests between champions to display their dominance. That being said, there appeared to be more to their methods. What she had observed and heard of thus far spoke of a certain amount of sophistication. Or was it simply a coincidence born of tribal conventions? She supposed that tribal conventions developed over time for good reason, so that was also a possibility. Ultimately, the result was more dire than she expected. The Draconic Kingdom was in big trouble because what the beastmen were effectively doing was creating a cutoff through their culling methods, leaving the surviving human population with a dismal average level. The oblivious sentry standing before her was a prime example of the problem. Beyond her sensing that the sentry was about the strength of an entry-level copper rank adventurer, he didn't even seem to have the correct job classes for sentry duty. Someone hiding in a wooded area to evade detection was certainly possible even when the one they were hiding from was much stronger and didn't have specialized detection abilities. Hiding in plain sight, however, was extraordinarily difficult and required a colossal difference between concealment and detection ability to pull off. Even with the concealment-enhancing equipment bestowed upon her by the Sorcerer King, standing in the open mere centimeters in front of someone would have her detected by all but the weakest of soldiers and those of civilian occupation. She understood why soldiers and militia might have suffered the most from the culling methods of the beastmen, but it appeared that even civilian occupations like alchemists and priests were subjected to the same treatment. If things were as bad as she suspected, the entire Draconic Kingdom had been culled to basic functionality. They would not only have to rebuild their country and its industries, but they would have to fill the hole left in their population and class-level demographics. The oblivious sentry rubbed his eyes and yawned. She frowned down at the man, wondering how people could see right through concealed individuals even if they weren't capable of foiling their stealth, at least until he leaned forward to stick his head between her knees. Her gauntleted hand came down and grabbed him across the forehead, pushing him back. Don't. Oh, gods, please. In hindsight, she should have activated her silence item first. Nearby sentries came running as she hopped down onto the walkway of the wall. Several drew their bows while others brandished spearheads in her direction. She let go of the man and reached into her infinite haversack. By order of Queen Auriculus, she produced the royal writ that had been provided to her. Stand down. The siege of Seagate has been broken. I am Baroness Ludmila Zarodnik, commander of the forces removing the beastmen from the area. Their eyes went from her to the writ in her hand. After several moments, the sentries with drawn bows grew weary and lowered their arms. That really a royal writ? One of them asked. Dunno, said another. I ain't seen one before. What does it say? I can't read shit. Can anyone read? Ludmila held in a sigh. She, a foreigner, could read the Draconic Kingdom's language, while the locals couldn't. Then again, it was probably to be expected. The sentries were probably drawn from the remaining population of spares in the town. The remaining literate citizens were artisans, clergy or merchants being kept safe for their skills and magic. The seal kinda looks like the sign on the flag, another man offered. I can wait until you locate an official. Ludmila crossed her arms. Please, be quick about it, though, I'd like to head back to the capital soon. The men exchanged looks again. One of them gestured with his chin to another. Go get the guildmaster, he said. We'll keep an eye on her. Rather than keeping an eye on her, it felt like they were getting an eyeful of her. Ludmila put away the royal writ and drew her mantle shut, but the men continued staring. She wanted to admonish them for being derelict in their duties, but it was probably pointless with how poorly trained they were. Why the guildmaster? She asked. Shouldn't you have sent for the local lord? Count's dead, one of the sentries said. One of the first to go. His barons that made it to the town went after that. Their families, too. At first, Ludmila thought that the nobles in the capital's palace quarter were targeted because they lived in the most affluent dwellings, attracting beastmen with not only food, but wealth. North and South Seagate were being raided rather than overrun and pillaged, however, so it seemed that they were being targeted on purpose in a similar manner to veteran soldiers and capable casters. It was probably because they were seen as human lords and unfortunately treated as demi-human lords would be, but something else was going on that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "What's going on here?" A cranky-sounding voice came up the gatehouse stairs. "I don't hear any of those damn dogs barking." "I told you, Guildmaster, someone's come and claimed to be the Queen." "Nonsense," the first voice snorted. "How could our dear Queen be here? She should be safe in the capital." A short man in loose-fitting clothes appeared a moment later, breathing heavily as he reached the top of the wall. Ludmila retrieved the royal writ again, holding it out to the man to inspect. His eyes scanned the scroll before he took off his felt hat to reveal a shining scalp. Who? Baroness Ludmila Zaradnik, military commander of the forces of the Sorceress Kingdom here in the Draconic Kingdom. Her Majesty, Queen Auriculas, has enlisted our aid in dealing with the hostile invasion of her lands. Baroness Zaradnik, the man lowered his head. "I'm Olorono Olorero, Master of the Seagate Merchant Guild. On behalf of Seagate and its citizens, I offer my most heartfelt thanks for the rescue of our dear town. We hope you understand that, given our circumstances, our resources are scarce, but you and your men shall be offered what hospitality we can afford." Ludmila frowned inwardly at Guildmaster Olorero's polished response. Two guildmasters speaking on behalf of Seagate. Seagate was effectively two towns, but something about the way they presented themselves rubbed her the wrong way. "I have some instructions to leave with the town's leadership before heading back to the capital," she said. "Please gather any remaining administrative staff, militia officers, guildmasters and temple representatives to the town square." 30 minutes later, she was delivering the same instructions to the citizens as she had delivered to the southern half. Once again, when the local representative for the temples of the Six made himself known, she felt the bile of the people directed against him. Was it truly fair for him to be the recipient of so much hatred? He continued to work faithfully in service to the people, but they were seemingly holding him accountable for the theocracy's lack of military aid. She wondered whether it was happening all over the country, and the thought followed her as she returned to her forces. "Welcome back, Lady Zaradnik," Olga said. "Did everything go okay?" "About the same as the other side," Ludmila answered. "What did you two think of the merchant guildmaster from the south town?" "I didn't like him," Olga frowned. "He was creepy at first and then he tried to act like the most important person around after that." "Wasn't he the most important person around?" Raoul said. "All the other big people got eaten. And we just appeared out of nowhere and beat up all those beastmen. How else would he act after that?" Olga looked away with a humph. Having varied opinions was a good thing, but they weren't at the point where they could explore their respective positions, only disagree. "Raoul's explanation seems rational," Ludmila said, "but do you think that anything else was going on?" "The people were really mad at that one priest, my lady," Olga replied. "Everyone was just a ball of feelings just standing there until you started sorting their stuff out." "They were in big trouble," Raoul nodded. "But they could still be mad at the priest. What did he even do? He was one of ours, wasn't he?" "I don't know how the faith of the Six operates in the Draconic Kingdom," Ludmila said, "but I do know that the slain theocracy usually helps them out when the beastmen come. They didn't this time and they're blaming the priest because the theocracy is seen as the seat of our faith." "That doesn't make any sense," Raoul frowned. "People don't have to make sense," Ludmila smirked. "If you want to make sense of people not making sense, you shouldn't assume that people are rational. All races have a nature unique to them and possess behaviors that stem both from that nature and the sum of their experiences. In this case, you don't need to know everything about the townsfolk, just what I told you about the theocracy." Olga and Raoul got onto their mounts as the undead finished gathering. Ludmila had her shadow demons, as well as sets of wraiths from each of the elder liches, sweep ahead of their return up the north side of the river. "So they're blaming the priest because—" Olga's brows drew together. "They think the priest is part of the theocracy?" "You're on the right track," Ludmila said, "but you have to go deeper than that, or perhaps broader would be more correct. Humans tend to associate things with other things. Furthermore, that sense of association can be distilled into symbolism. This is useful for some things and dangerous for others. For instance, if Chef Pyrrhus makes an amazing meal, people associate the meal with him. When they think of his restaurant, they think of the chef. Everything about its operation, good or bad, is pinned onto him. Most people don't think past that point. They don't think about what his staff do to help out, the farmers and other people that supply good ingredients, the undead that help with industry and provide security, or the people who manage everything to make it possible to even have a restaurant in the harbor. But making dinner is his job, right? Raoul said. He's responsible for his work. There are certain things that he's responsible for, Ludmila agreed, but some things are just out of his control. Not everyone cares to think about it when it happens, and not everyone is reasonable if an explanation is given. The more responsibility someone has, the worse this gets, because more and more things are associated with them, and the more abstract the average person's grasp of those things becomes. Doesn't that mean that you get stuck with this sort of thing all the time, my lady? Olga asked. The way the faith of the Six defines one's roles in life helps quite a lot with preventing this, Ludmila answered, but it does happen frequently for people in positions of leadership. Everyone wants things to go their way, or at least remain stable. They want to be able to raise their families safely and see success. A noble has to deal with all these desires from thousands or even tens of thousands of tenants and figure out how to best see to them, but the situation of a fief isn't always good. As a rough example, if there is a drought, many things happen at once. The harvest ends up being poor and food becomes scarce. This drives up the price of food beyond what people can afford. People get weak and sick, and the temples get overburdened, if there are any, to begin with. Some people might turn to crime to make ends meet. External forces might act against a fief while this goes on. This can be neighbors who are also suffering from the same drought and resorting to raids, or just lawless opportunists preying on the vulnerable. If a lord doesn't provide tax relief, they might be seen as cruel by their tenants. If they do provide tax relief, they still have to deal with all those other things going on. With less money and food on hand, they are less capable of maintaining order and keeping infrastructure in good repair. Then, what the people thought was a good thing becomes a bad thing, but they still blame the noble because it's their job to keep everyone safe. Ones that amass wealth to deal with emergencies might be seen as selfish and greedy when emergencies don't happen. Almost no one lauds them for their prudence when they are prepared to deal with unexpected events. Then you should let people know what's really going on, Raoul said. Well, that requires resources, too, Ludmila replied. A noble could hire more retainers or have knights. They can put their banners everywhere to remind people that they are the ones in charge. They can use some combination of propaganda and education to make sure that the people are always on the leadership's side. Highly visible projects work, too, so long as they aren't seen as foolish or wasteful. Now that she was expanding on the subject, Ludmila realized that she had been doing all those things without actively thinking about it. Everything was strangely monumental, starting from the fortified farming villages and their light towers. Lyndon Roscoe had said as much the previous spring, but what was going on hadn't sunk in. Also, certain methods can be employed out of laziness or desperation, Ludmila said. Irresponsible people will often seek to shift blame onto others, whether justified or not. Sometimes, the boots that someone puts on are too big for them and it all becomes too much. Their instincts scream at them to run away because they don't want to be the person taking the blame. The worst are the ones who try to maintain what they see as a favorable position while sacrificing everyone else around them. Some even believe that they are completely justified in doing so. But that's not you, my lady, Olga said. You should build a huge statue so everyone knows how great you are. Her apprentice threw out her hands. Ludmila's lip twitched. I don't think that would be appropriate. Statues are expensive, too. I didn't see any statues of the Queen anywhere on our map of the capital, Raoul said. Why does everyone like her, anyway? They hate the priest for the theocracy not helping them, but no one blames the Queen for not being able to stop the invaders. That's a good question. What was she doing? While they hadn't been in the Draconic Kingdom for long, it was utterly strange that absolutely no one seemed to resent Queen Auricula's for their situation. In fact, it was the exact opposite. They adored her despite everything that had happened. Lady Zaradnik, Psycho said from her side, the reconnaissance vanguard has reached the first line of villages. Did they encounter any beastmen or human survivors? None, the elder Lich replied. Neither are they able to determine how long ago the most recent activity was. They arrived at one of the villages along the road shortly after, where she checked through the empty dwellings. Not only had the beastmen taken away the occupants, but metalwork and cloth had been looted as well. Furnishings, books and documents had been left behind, as were stockpiles of firewood. Going by the condition of the village and its surroundings, it had been left undisturbed for weeks. Ludmila located the home of the village chief and leafed through the settlement's records. The last entry was over 3 months old. "Psycho," she asked, "what was the frequency of production professions in the beastman camps? The number of metal workers, for instance?" "Rare. At least by what we could identify as vocational facilities. Those resembling smithies were next to non-existent." It was in line with what Chief Venomscale had noted. The beastmen seemed to possess no significant artifice when it came to metalworking. That they had occasional pieces of high-quality work might be attributed to external sources or spoils from raids of neighboring countries. Some of it could be reasoned out as the fact that, with their natural weapons, certain types of equipment were unnecessary. There were other things, however, that should have existed. Tell headquarters to compile their findings of each camp. Both those that we've already taken and the ones we clear in the future. We need to develop a better idea of their industries and economy. Beyond their basic needs, they had no idea of the beastmen's sense of material value beyond what they stopped to loot. At some point, those valuables had to go somewhere for them to be worth carrying around. "For that matter," she added, "have we encountered a beastman merchant yet?" "Not that we have identified," Psycho said. "Though determining whether stockpiles of goods are tribal inventories or merchant inventories is next to impossible with the information that we currently have. Maybe the others can make some sense out of everything when they get here. Let's move on, I'm going to help with reconnaissance." Ludmila activated her hairpin and ascended roughly 50 meters over the ground. Given the strength of the beastman sentries that they had encountered, concealing herself from that height would render her effectively undetectable. She skimmed back and forth ahead of their advance, pondering what they had discovered since their arrival. Aside from what she considered as the basics, nothing was as expected. The nature of the beastman invasion, the behavior of the Draconic Kingdom's citizens, how the conflict had played out and the approach that they would have to take to resolve it. She couldn't even decide whether it was the result of overthinking based on certain assumptions or if the reality of the situation being out of the ordinary was the culprit of the divergence between expectations and reality. It's a good thing Clara is in charge of this offensive. While Ludmila would have certainly been able to end the beastman invasion with the forces at her disposal, Clara was prepared to implement solutions for both the invasion and the state of the Draconic Kingdom in the aftermath. The plight of the Draconic Kingdom was common knowledge in the region, yet she was the only one that decisively moved to not just alleviate their woes, but end them permanently. She had been preparing for it since shortly after the annexation of Erantal, and people could see the bits and pieces of what she was doing. Yet, at the same time, most had no idea what she was doing right up to the moment that it happened. Clara was lauded as a genius, and it was undeniably so, but it was her foresight and endless toil that turned the garden that she envisioned into reality. The catastrophe unfolding in the Draconic Kingdom seemed like nothing but a golden opportunity, proving that opportunities were best seized by the prepared. As dawn approached, she landed at the town opposite the river to the Draconic Kingdom's capital. It was perhaps one of the least affected by the occupation, if only for the fact that the residents had fled across the river to take refuge in the capital. Their riverboats were moored on the far shore, but the efforts of the beastmen had sunk them there. Psycho arrived with Olga and Raoul, both of whom had by then fallen sound asleep against the backs of the Death Cavaliers. A warm smile spread over Ludmila's face at the sight. "I should have requested rings of sustenance for them," she said. "We're going to be campaigning for a long while." "Should they not have been divided into shifts like Commander Willuvian and Commander Leluvian?" Psycho asked. "It was a thought," Ludmila replied, "but there are things on the ground that can't be seen from a war room. Some believe that wars can be waged from a distance, but that same distance removes you from many of its most important aspects. I don't know what the future of our officer corps holds, but I do know that simply turning everything into ashes and dust is not enough to achieve what His Majesty desires for the Sorcerer's Kingdom." They returned to the palace as the sun rose over the city walls. Ludmila tucked the children into their beds before heading down to the war room. "Any new orders for me, Commander Lynham?" she asked. "You are." Leluvian shuddered. "Please don't do that ever again, my lady. It feels so wrong." Ludmila hid a grin behind her hand. It would probably take a lot of getting used to. Well, I'm the one not getting any commander benefits from you two. You need to rid yourself of those antiquated and erroneous notions. One's role has nothing to do with one's rank in the Royal Army. I may be the chief of staff for this operation, but you're a commander and I'm a captain and we operate as such. At this rate, it's going to affect Olga and Raoul's education. You're already doing everything else you need to be doing anyway, so you may as well give up and accept it. But it's so weird, my lady, Leluvian replied. In what strange world does a maid order their mistress around? You may want to ask Amelia about that at some point, Ludmila smirked. I'm fairly certain she has absolute control over several aspects of my life. Anyway, how are things progressing in the Dead March? There, Gem, shuffling along? Leluvian answered, the zombies aren't very fast, my lady. They're covering roughly 2 kilometers per hour. It's a good thing that they can march all day. I was hoping to lose a fair number of them by now. Ludmila eyed the map. Does that mean we haven't met with much resistance yet? Some fights have broken out here and there. If our analysis of the reports is correct, they were sentries of what we might consider the beastman warrior caste. Those sentries haven't suffered a single loss yet, but they don't stick around to fight indefinitely. I wonder if that means their real army is out there and they've just left behind civilians to occupy the land. Just going by the numbers and how they're being deployed, Leluvian said, most of the beastmen in the northwest are civilians as well. Otherwise, 2 or 3 tribe-sized forces would have confronted the main wave of undead instead of consolidating with the rest of the tribes. The Katsa force had nearly crossed half of the Dead March and the beastmen were amassing ahead of them. It appeared that every tribe northwest of Blighthold was on the move, while those to the south hadn't budged. What have our wraiths and bone vultures found out for us? They can't tell what's what, my lady, Leluvian said, but we do have some rough figures. There are about 3,000 lion beastmen in that blob forming at the front. About 7,000 more are still on the way. And the human population? The estimate is just over 200,000, including those inside Blighthold. Ludmila reached out and took a folder from the table near where Blighthold was marked on the map, flipping through the Draconic Kingdom census data. The original population of the territory in question was stated to be 300,000, so it seemed that the beastmen had been there for 5 or 6 months. This was clearly unsustainable, further lending to the impression that not everything was as it seemed on the invaders' end. What about Blighthold's supply situation? We sent wraiths through the warehouses and nearly all of them are empty. The city is harboring about 3 times its normal population at the moment. But I thought we determined that there was no need for them to do so, Ludmila frowned. That assessment still stands, my lady, Leluvian said. The way that the beastmen are managing things makes it so that people can work in the countryside, but, well, they're probably just scared, my lady. A city has walls and there is safety in numbers, or at least it's less likely that you're the next meal when there are so many other targets around. Human irrationality knows no bounds, Psycho said. Abandoning productive tasks has only resulted in supply shortages. I suppose we should move the commercial schedule up a bit. Due to the unexpected developments for the Draconic Kingdom, the plans that Clara had come up with had to be dismantled and hastily pieced back together into something serviceable. At the point that Ludmila had left Corlin Harbor, there were 2 schedules for their operation in the Draconic Kingdom. The first was the military schedule, which involved the campaign to end the Beastman occupation and set up the Sorceress Kingdom's security forces. Running in tandem with that was the commercial schedule, which was the effort to get the Draconic Kingdom on the road to economic recovery as quickly as possible. Though called schedules, they weren't anything so precise. They were more akin to a broad set of objectives, short-term targets and loose contingencies that they would use to guide them as they felt their way forward. The progress of the 2 schedules hinged on the negotiations conducted between the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation and the government of the Draconic Kingdom. With things as dire as they were, Leanne suspected that the Sorceress Kingdom would be able to get away with nearly anything. Clara, however, wouldn't allow it because it was a sort of borderline coercion that set unacceptable precedents. The Sorceress Kingdom could never be seen as miserly or exploitative, and their work in the Draconic Kingdom would serve as a case study for their nation's official diplomatic corps in the future. In that case, Ludmila said, we should begin negotiations as soon as possible. Continue scouting upriver with summons and shadow demons. Start cleaning up the empty beastmen camps outside the walls with the infantry company. The sergeants already know what we're looking for. We'll resume operations once I get Lady Corlin's party up to date on what's going on.
Yes,
my lady. Ludmila descended the tower and entered the hallways of the royal palace, heading to the stateroom that had been set aside for the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. 2 members of the palace guard standing at the entrance saluted her as she came to a stop before them. Has everything been prepared to receive the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation? She asked. Most everything, my lady, one of the guards answered. Meals will be limited due to the city's rationing measures and proper entertainment is yet to be arranged. You have the palace's most sincere apologies. Our purpose is to negotiate a way for your country to restore itself to order and prosperity, Ludmila told him. We already understand that you are in a difficult situation, so attempting to curry our favor with luxuries may deliver the wrong impression, yes? Of course, my lady. She went to inspect the interior of the stateroom, which was roughly the size of one of Randall's guest manors. Pieces of art were displayed on the walls and mounted on pedestals along the corridors, but she had no sense of their value, artistic or otherwise. She wasn't even sure what some of them were supposed to be. The stateroom's chambers were divided into a drawing room, hall and office for receiving guests in the front half, while a solar and chambers for household staff occupied the rear half. The solar had 2 bedrooms with attached wardrobes, an office and a lounge with a balcony that overlooked the western gardens. Beyond was a view of the capital with the river on its course to the sea. After checking the security of the stateroom and locating no traps, secret compartments or hidden areas, Ludmila returned to the tower. Psycho, she said. Contact Randall. We are ready to receive Lady Corlin's delegation. Within 5 minutes, the dark portal of a gate spell appeared in a corner of the war room. Leanne poked her head out. This really the Draconic Kingdom? She asked. The city of Oraculon, seat of House Auriculus on the Oraculon River in the Oraculon Reach? Why else would the rest of us be here? Ludmila gestured to her general staff. Dunno. This is my first time using a gate. Whose gate is this? Lady Pestonia's. Wee yow. Leanne let out a yelp and stumbled out of the portal. She rubbed her ear while Florine and Clara joined her. Which one of you did that? Leanne demanded. I wonder, Florine said. Your behind was sticking out for everyone to see, so it could have been anyone. Their ladies' maids appeared behind them, carrying 2 pieces of luggage each. A moment later, the gate dissipated. Have there been any changes to our plans since I left? Ludmila asked. I feel like that should be our question, Clara answered. Our delegation's task essentially remains unchanged, but the reports we've been receiving since your arrival here have been alarming. We probably have to start supplying Blighthold a week early, Ludmila said. But a week early as now, Leanne frowned. Wasn't it supposed to be a special occasion for a certain someone? Florine said. It won't be much of a special occasion if the city starves before our shipments get to it, Ludmila said. The population is already decimated, so we need to preserve what we can. That won't be a problem, Clara said. Has Queen Auriculus prepared her negotiators? I'm not sure, Ludmila said. I half suspect that she'll conduct the negotiations personally. What she's cobbled together out of her palace staff is stretched thin as it is managing the city. Guess that's one way to cut through the bureaucracy, Leanne said. Just negotiate with collapsing governments. When do we start? 10th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 0900 hours. My queen, the delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom has arrived. Draudillan looked up from her paperwork with a furrow on her youthful brow. When will they arrive at the palace? She asked. They are already in the palace, Your Majesty, Captain Scarvo said, but none of the palace guard noted their arrival outside. Did they fly? Considering the apparent strength of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces, some variety of teleportation magic wasn't out of the question. Her thoughts meandered for a moment while she considered appropriate protocols for teleporting guests. Casters that could use similar means were so rare that there was little consideration put into their treatment and regulation. Where are they right now? In the stateroom we've prepared for them. They've sent word that they'd like to begin negotiations at your next convenience. My next convenience, huh? It was more like she was awaiting the Sorceress Kingdom's convenience. In a world where differences in both personal and collective power could be so extreme that notions of equality were nothing more than a fool's delusion, it was common for conventions and polite conduct to be cast aside simply because that difference in power allowed one to do whatever they wished. Many exulted in it and exploited every advantage with no consideration for the other party. There was an old saying about meeting the same people on their way down as they met on the way up. The delegation's behavior could be seen as an expression of confidence in the Draconic Kingdom's recovery and the desire for a relationship not predicated by power, but framed by a code of civil conduct that superseded savage measures. Another way to interpret their actions was that the seeming lack of desire for control suggested absolute control. Most relied on threats, bravado and overt, repeated displays of strength to assert dominance in whatever their arena might be. Dylan considered those types of people little more than animals. Individuals who carried themselves with a sense of cool confidence through which the weight of their position could be subtly felt were far more dangerous in her mind. She looked over her shoulder at Sabos, who remained attentive and alert for threats to her person since his arrival. The Sorcerer King's royal butler had said little beyond polite exchanges, but Dylan couldn't say that she had put much effort into enticing anything out of him. Her responsibilities as queen took precedence, and the fact that it felt like she was trying to scrape together a flea market's worth of economic clout for the upcoming negotiations didn't help with her sense of self-worth. Lady Austin. Yes, Your Majesty. Gather the royal court. Once everyone is here, we will hold our first audience with the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. Most are out working in the city. It shouldn't take more than 2 hours for us to summon the court and prepare. Dylan nodded and sent Ina on her way. She then rose from her throne, gathering up the documents summarizing the Draconic Kingdom's position and potential avenues for negotiation. A tiny frown marred her face as she read over them on her way back to the royal apartments. With things as they were, all she could offer were promises. A picture of how things were when beastmen weren't running all over the place and eating everyone. Even that couldn't remotely be claimed as nominal anymore. The Draconic Kingdom had been subjected to more than a year of constant predation by the beastman invaders. She let out a weary sigh after leaving Sabos at the entrance of her apartments. Even if they did drive the beastmen away, the Draconic Kingdom's economy would be crippled. Tax revenues would be next to non-existent until the harvest, and she would consider it extraordinarily lucky if they could produce a third of what was normal. Furthermore, what limited resources they had to spare needed to go to restoration efforts, or they would never crawl out of the pit that they had been pushed into. In other countries, it was common for landlords to make allowances for victims of raids and areas devastated by natural disasters. These mostly came in the form of dues being postponed or waived entirely in an effort to facilitate a return to normal productivity. In the Draconic Kingdom, however, this sort of reprieve was not enough. The marauding beastmen who inflicted losses with their raids did not do so on rare occasions, they came all the time. A lord would lose a handful of tenants in one village and then lose a handful more in another village 2 weeks later. It was both a sad fact and a saving grace that their neighbors treated the Draconic Kingdom as a hunting preserve, which meant that they only hunted as much as the population could sustain. What was sustainable was, of course, determined by the beastmen. All that the Draconic Kingdom could do was make the best of their difficult situation. Taxes were pooled, adventurers were hired and soldiers were trained. Every beastman that they killed was one less beastman that needed to eat, and if people were going to die anyway, those deaths may as well come at a cost to their assailants. At least one avenue was clear to us. They were desperate for manpower anyway, and the adventurers had all fled, so the portion of the budget that usually went to border security, that was, commissioning adventurers and training soldiers, could be offered to the Sorceress Kingdom. Given how powerful and effective their forces appeared to be, Dylan was under no illusion that she could afford much, but something was better than nothing. The hours passed as she prepared, donning a less absurd-looking outfit than before. Still, it was something that suited a child, and it still revealed more skin than she would have liked. Layers of diaphanous white silks caused her figure to cast a clear silhouette in the morning sun, projecting the image of the pure and innocent queen that her people adored. Her straight black hair was arranged into coils atop her head, fixed with an array of silver pins that radiated from her dragon crown. It was about as much as she allowed herself, lest she risk conveying the idea that she was in a better situation than she actually was. Your Majesty, Ina arrived in a fresh dress. Your courtiers have assembled and await your arrival. What about the delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom? They're still awaiting your Majesty's summons in their stateroom. I thought you might like to address your court before the audience.
Our court,
Huh.
Such that it is, Ina offered Draudilin a mirthless smile.
Draudilin regarded her lady-in-waiting with a sense of silent melancholy.
Ina's expression was not unlike that of her late Prime Minister. She reached up and patted Ina's cheeks.
You're 30 years too early to be making faces like your uncle, Draudilin told her.
The last thing we need is this audience looking like a funeral.
Don't tell us everyone else is carrying themselves like this.
I think we'll be all right, Your Majesty, Ina replied.
These past few days have just been so overwhelming. From the city falling to a sudden overnight reversal, I think what came after was even weightier than that. So many things we took for granted that have fallen apart.
Well, at least everyone's not penned up as livestock.
This sorceress kingdom seems civil so far. Things will probably take a turn for the better, yes?
At least that was her hope.
The sorceress kingdom's envoys were civil, yet gave little away and showed little interest in anything beyond their work. The steely professionalism that they had shown thus far made her wonder what she would be facing at the negotiating table. Sabos fell into step behind Draudilin as she left the royal apartments with Ina. Upon returning to the throne room, heads turned and she was greeted by applause from the occupants. She put on a smile and nodded as she went by, trying her best not to think bitter thoughts.
They came anyway. Why are they even clapping?
It's like they're congratulating me for not being eaten. If I had used wild magic before things grew too far out of hand, would the sorceress kingdom still have come? Considering what they claimed to be there for and how they carried themselves, she was reasonably certain that it would have been the case. With the draconic kingdom in much better condition, she would have been able to negotiate from a much stronger position. The mountain of regret over her indecision only grew the more she dwelled upon it. She settled onto her throne, examining her hall full of admiring courtiers. They were at most half the age of the ministers, high lords and other officials that should have been there. With time as short as it was and other duties pressing them, she opted against putting together a new set of diplomatic staff. In effect, they were bodies to fill the throne room and lend a bit of gravitas to the proceedings. We thank everyone for their hard work, Draudilin's voice carried over the assembled nobles. While the beastmen threat to the capital is no longer imminent, there will be many trials ahead for the draconic kingdom. The time for bearing arms has passed. Now is the time that your talents will come to the fore. You are the few who understand that the fight ahead is no less critical to the fate of your country. Your unwavering support gives us much needed strength, and we hope you will all continue to lend your support in the times to come. The groups of nobles in the hall clamored over one another, pledging their eternal loyalty and service. Words of encouragement flowed over her, which sounded like words of encouragement for a child, but she had grown accustomed to it over the years. She raised a hand and they fell silent again. All must know that our country currently does not have much to offer, so we must ask that everyone does their utmost to display what hospitality they can and impress their sincerity on our guests. As more of the draconic kingdom is reclaimed from the beastmen, you will be responsible for ensuring that the rest of the aristocracy understands this. Our country has gone through too much for a thoughtless gaffe to rob it of this precious opportunity. Heads nodded around the throne room and the assembled nobles organized themselves into neat rows according to their rank and position. Draudilin's golden eyes went to the door and she nodded. Bring our guests before us, Captain Scarvo.
At once, Your Majesty.
The throne room doors closed behind the captain and Draudilin stared at the hole that was still there. She pondered whether it should be repaired as soon as possible for appearance's sake, or be left as a sobering reminder of the situation that they were in until their troubles had passed. 5 minutes later, the captain reappeared, stopping to the side of the entrance. Introducing the delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom, the Right Honourable the Countess of Corlin, the Right Honourable the Countess of Wagner, the Right Honourable the Baroness of Gonye. As they were announced, 6 women made their way up the dark carpet laid over the polished marble floors. 3 of them appeared to be attendants, as they immediately withdrew to a side area at the back of the hall. The nobles arranged on either side of the long carpet stretching from the doorway cast curious glances their way, as they had not been announced and their identity could only be guessed at. Draudilin kept her expression neutral, examining who had come to represent the Sorceress Kingdom. In the center was a tall woman, as tall or taller than most of the men present, with lush waves of blonde hair that ended just below her shoulders. The cobalt blue dress with silver filigree draped between her shoulders marked her as someone of conservative disposition, or at least one who had decided to express herself in a reserved fashion. Even so, her radiant beauty could not be denied, but what drew Dylan's attention were her amethyst eyes and pale complexion. Is that the blood of the theocracy's gods, or traces of the old imperial dynasty? She couldn't tell at a glance, but, either way, it marked her as someone to be wary of. On either side of Countess Corlin stood two women who were both half a head shorter. Countess Wagner stood on the left, with topaz blue eyes set on a petite face framed by tight waves of flaxen hair. Her mode of dress was 2 degrees more daring than that of Countess Corlin, though Dylan wasn't sure whether it was a result of a purposeful calculation or simple whim. She was clearly of imperial descent, her name and features marking her as the blood of a house that had originated from the Harut's east or southeastern marches. Baroness Gonnier was the most well-endowed of the trio, which she appeared to be painfully conscious of. Though she was just as conservatively dressed as Countess Corlin, hiding her womanly figure was something of an exercise in futility. Dirty blonde hair that hung past her shoulders matched the smoldering amber of her eyes. She had all the makings of a prolific seductress, the type that would only be envied and admired for the throngs of men that she ensnared rather than reviled for it. Yet, instead of being confident about her appearance, she appeared overly timid. A timid seductress, if that made any sense. Another noteworthy thing between the three was that they were all for young. Most of her palace staff appeared to be older. It was an unexpected jab at Dylan's situation. She had young nobles aplenty, but instead had opted to negotiate directly. There may also have been other reasons for the selection, such as lulling the opposite party into a false sense of security over the apparent youth and inexperience of the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. Feminine appeal was of course a factor, as men usually conducted matters of state. Throwing nubile young noblewomen at officials could be an effective tactic, but it wouldn't work since Dylan was personally heading the negotiations for the Draconic Kingdom. This, of course, went both ways. Dylan couldn't use the appeal of an eligible young queen to tilt negotiations in her favor when no one at the table was attracted to women. Maybe she would be able to tickle their maternal instincts with her childlike appearance. The three noblewomen lined up before Dylan's dais and lowered themselves into deep curtsies. Dylan took in their silent displays of respect for a moment before speaking. "We are Dylan Auriculus, Black-Scaled Dragon Lord and Queen of the Draconic Kingdom. For a nation to come so far to provide unsolicited succor is an unheard-of thing in these times, and we are unable to adequately express our gratitude for your doing so. Our warmest welcome goes to the Sorceress Kingdom. May the future of our two nations be one marked by mutual goodwill and prosperity." It was a greeting suitable for the Draconic Kingdom's situation, which was incapable of offering much more than heartfelt thanks and pinned its hopes on a reasonable settlement that hinged on a long-term relationship with the Sorceress Kingdom. A part of her complained that it failed to convey the grandeur and prestige of a sovereign and what a nation should be, but establishing a set of reasonable expectations with the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation took priority. "The Sorceress Kingdom thanks you for your welcome, Queen Auriculus," Countess Corlin replied. "Too long has the world been shrouded in a veil of darkness where peoples and nations vanish alone into the void. With the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom comes the dawn of a new era, and His Majesty the Sorcerer King, Ainzul Gaon, desires that his reign be marked by the harmony and prosperity that it brings. We would be most pleased if the Draconic Kingdom joins hands with us in this future." "Very good, this one knows how to dance." In response to hearing the Draconic Kingdom's position, the Sorceress Kingdom had presented its own. It was a breath of fresh air in a world where most would abuse an advantageous position to boorishly impose upon another party. Those who were being imposed upon could do little but acquiesce to the arbitrary demands of those who were only interested in getting what they wanted. The details were not a concern, they were solely the problem of the one being made to produce what was required. The results of that sort of diplomacy never lasted, as expectations and reality would inevitably drift apart. By opening the negotiations in the way that she did, Countess Corlin indicated that the Sorceress Kingdom was here to negotiate rather than dictate. It was consistent with the idea that they were here to establish a long-term relationship with the Draconic Kingdom, not exact payment for services rendered or make arbitrary demands. Even so, there were traps hidden in her words. The consistency between Sabos, Baroness Zaradnik and the now-arrived delegation of Countess Corlin served to paint an image and establish a premise. One could not disregard the fact that,
Despite its seemingly benevolent position, the Sorceress Kingdom held an overwhelming advantage over the Draconic Kingdom. The dance of diplomacy had begun, and it was clear that Countess Corlin was leading that dance. Some fools danced as they pleased simply because the accompanying music was agreeable. As nations were constructs of law and order, however, the steps to their dance could not be ignored. Draudillan offered her guests a brilliant smile, well spoken. We look forward to discovering what our two nations might forge together. Are there any pressing matters that you would like to bring to our attention? Since our forces have secured a logistical corridor to the capital, Countess Corlin replied, we would first like to secure facilities for our transports. The reports from Baroness Saradnik state that the capital has over a week of food left, but establishing proper supply chains is something that takes time. A prudent course of action, Draudillan nodded. We shall take care of that, then. By the way, where is Baroness Saradnik? We thought she would be present as a member of your delegation. Baroness Saradnik is the chief of staff of our military forces in the Draconic Kingdom. For the most part, she will be overseeing our military operations wherever they are being conducted. I believe that most of your Majesty's interactions with her will be related to those duties. I see. In that case, lunch will be served shortly. My nobles must return to their duties and the throne room will be furnished to host our talks. Let us refresh ourselves on the balcony and we shall hear the beginnings of your offer. The audience adjourned and they went to look over the river from the throne room balcony. In addition to Sabos and the three noble women from the Sorceress Kingdom, Ina, Lena and Jolene balanced the numbers on Draudillan's side. Spring in the Draconic Kingdom can be quite balmy, she told her guests. We hope the climate does not bother you overly much. I live on the Katza River myself, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin said, so I am no stranger to humidity. The air is much warmer here, however, the mountain winds do not appear to do much to cool your lands. That much is true, Draudillan replied, but there's a good bit of rain all year. Also, the climate here is less extreme than that of the Empire or Riastais. You will probably experience this yourself, yes? We will be traveling back and forth between the Draconic Kingdom and the Sorceress Kingdom, but I believe that we will be able to experience every season in your country. Then we shall reserve your accommodations year-round, Draudillan nodded. Now, where were we? You probably already know this, but our government is not in the best state at the moment. This is Lady Yorston, who is usually one of my ladies-in-waiting but has temporarily occupied the post of Prime Minister. Lady Delaros currently fills the post of Royal Treasurer and Lady Wenwyn is overseeing internal affairs. The noble women exchanged cordial greetings before Draudillan moved to the topic at hand. Now, you mentioned something about securing facilities for your transports. The order of everything is turned upside down, so we hope you do not mind how irregular these negotiations may become. On the contrary, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin replied, we are most pleased to be able to deal with you directly. Our transports require specialized infrastructure, so the opening step for us would be to secure a lease for harbor space. How much space do you require? In response, Countess Corlin produced a map from a pouch at her hip. It was only then that it struck Draudillan as odd. The formal wear of noble women did not usually include belts with containers. The adornment added an adventurous flavor to the three noble women from the Sorceress Kingdom, and she idly wondered about their houses' backgrounds. She received the map from Countess Corlin. A 200 by 200 meter stretch of waterfront had been marked out near the city's western wall. In better times, Draudillan said as she examined the map, this would be a difficult arrangement. We do not foresee any issues accommodating it for now, however. What does this proposed lease entail? In addition to the port facilities, Countess Corlin said, we would like for it to be legally recognized as an exclave. Our diplomatic mission would be housed there, as would offices for our merchant companies. Treating a diplomatic mission as an exclave was not strange, but Draudillan had never heard of one being combined with port facilities or merchant operations. If I may ask, Countess Corlin, Ina spoke to her left, does that mean we would be treating it as a territory of the Sorceress Kingdom? It does, Lady Yorston, Countess Corlin replied. The laws of the Sorceress Kingdom would be observed there. What about taxes? Lena asked. If I assume correctly, goods from the Sorceress Kingdom will flow into the Draconic Kingdom from your facilities there. Trade taxes can be collected as usual when goods leave the exclave. As the harbor facilities are maintained by the Sorceress Kingdom, we of course expect none of the associated fees. Drawdillon weighed the costs and benefits of allowing the arrangement. Since the Draconic Kingdom had likely lost a substantial portion of its population, it was space that would go unused. Logically, it made sense to lease it out, but leasing the land for an exclave was bound to raise objections. In a kingdom, land was usually granted, not leased. Recognition of rights and authority was drawn in straight lines or at least relative ones using rank as a measure. If the land was granted by the sovereign, respecting an exclave was the same as respecting the will of the crown. Nobles would more than happily accept this, as it fell within the framework of the society that they maintained. Leasing land, however, was different. Nobles were creatures who were bound to the land, and one might think that they had been asked to cut off a part of their own bodies when presented with the idea of leasing out a portion of their territory. Not only that, the exclave would be a place where the authority and rights that they were accustomed to held no sway. At first, they would probably think little of it, but it was likely to cause resentment as normal reasserted itself. As nobles themselves, the delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom should have understood this. Why had they chosen to request an exclave in such a manner? Considering what the lease included, maybe the Sorceress Kingdom's merchants had pushed for it. A sovereign port in a foreign land provided many advantages. It was somewhere merchants could go if they needed the assistance of their homeland, and it acted as a way station for goods that didn't incur local tariffs, taxes and tolls until they were exported to another country. It also meant that goods and personnel normally barred from passage through a country were effectively immune to that country's law enforcement. Though the fine details of what could and couldn't happen in an exclave could be negotiated, enforcing anything was practically impossible. In the worst case, it was a source of poison for a country that would require wars to resolve. Not that she believed they could win in any war against the Sorceress Kingdom. For how long will this lease be effective? Drawdillon asked. Ideally, Your Majesty, we would like for it to be indefinite, Countess Corlin answered, but 10 years should be reasonable enough to begin with. Furthermore, the terms of the lease may be reviewed and renegotiated every 2 years. We believe many changes will come to the Draconic Kingdom in that time, so we must be flexible according to those developments. We are not against the idea, Drawdillon said, but there are many questions that must be answered. For the time being, is it possible to begin your operations while we deliberate? Of course, Countess Corlin nodded. We have materials available should you have any concerns about the Sorceress Kingdom's laws. Seeing our operations in person should also help those with concerns with our request for a lease understand why we chose to make it. One of the palace staff informed them that the throne room had been prepared. They returned to a modest set of tables and benches arrayed along the sides of the Great Hall. The last time she had seen a similar arrangement was the night that Crystal Tear and numerous other adventurers had been butchered before her, so it was all she could do to keep from continually glancing towards the balcony window. Drawdillon seated herself on her throne, eyeing the food arrayed on the long table placed before it. She could hardly consider it appropriate for the occasion. The bread was fresh and the fish had come straight from the river, but that was about the most she could say in its favor. Preserved fruit had been added to soup flavored by what was left of their sausage, and a glop of pickled vegetables served as a meager side to their broiled fish. Sabos came around and filled their goblets with wine. The pale rosé was a perfect complement to their simple fare, and Drawdillon wondered if the royal butler's grasp of her situation had been expressed through the selection. Please do not stand on ceremony, Drawdillon said. Let us enjoy our meal while it is still hot. While we do so, we would like to know more about the Sorceress Kingdom. Powerful new countries usually do not spring up without warning, so we are curious how it came to be. His Majesty the Sorcerer King presented his claim to the region around Rantel the autumn before the last and pressed that claim during the Baharuth Empire's annual skirmish with the Riastais last winter. The outcome was decisive and the Duchy of Rantel was annexed. So the reports of the ridiculous magic caster presenting his claim had proven to be true. If the claim was for the area around Rantel, Drawdillon said, surely the Sorcerer King would lay claim to all of it and not just the Duchy of Rantel? Yes, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin replied. Since the annexation, the borders of the Sorceress Kingdom have grown to encompass the entirety of the Great Forest of Tob, the Azalizia Mountains and its surrounding foothills, and the Katza Plains. There has been some expansion in the southwest, as well. Doesn't that mean it's actually quite a large country?
The area described was roughly half the size of Baharuth or Eastais. In other words, about the same size as the Draconic Kingdom. Additionally, most of that territory was far from ideal for human habitation.
Is it a country of many races, then?
Draudilan asked, something like Carnassus and the other great nations of yore.
Races of all kinds are counted as citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom, Countess Corlin nodded.
Though I believe we have the sole distinction of being one that includes the undead amongst them.
That wasn't precisely true.
There were other countries that did have undead citizens, and there were even countries ruled by the undead, but they were in other parts of the world.
She had no idea how they functioned, but the stories often painted them as places where the dark powers of the world thrived. It was said that more than a few were at odds with their living neighbors. As far as she knew, all countries in the region considered the undead enemies of the living, so she couldn't imagine what was going on in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The undead army that had appeared to break the siege of the capital was out of sight by the same morning, and the palace staff pretended the ones currently occupying the northwest tower didn't exist. The city's temples were currently focused on putting the dead from the siege to rest, but she could imagine what they would say if the undead became a common sight in the Draconic Kingdom. Even the ever-licentious priests of the Mistress of Bounty would set aside their usual antics to stand in solidarity with the other faiths.
Since the Sorceress Kingdom seeks to establish economic ties,
Draudilan said,
does that mean that these races will come to the Draconic Kingdom?
It should be the case eventually, Countess Corlin replied.
This is a part of the reason for why we are requesting an exclave in the manner that we have.
Those of other races, beastmen, in particular, may not be well received given the Draconic Kingdom's recent history.
We are both providing a place of refuge for our citizens and offering a window into life in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Rather than forcing the issue, I believe it would be better for your subjects to embrace new realities on their own terms.
Countess Corlin's approach was yet another indication of the sheer leeway enjoyed by the Sorcerer's Kingdom. While it was true that forced change often led to many problems, it was rare to be in a situation where essential change did not need to be forced.
We are curious, Draudilan said.
As the Sorcerer's Kingdom is a multiracial state, why did you choose the Draconic Kingdom over our beastman neighbors?
They are far larger and more powerful, so we imagine there are quite a few more merits in supporting their cause over ours. The apparent policies of the beastmen are not in line with those of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Rest assured, we will always endeavor to promote our nation's objectives over convenient, short-term gains.
So that's it, then.
Diplomats and those in positions of leadership often garnish their intent in a frame of flowery words and idealistic sentiment. In the case of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, however, it appeared that flowery words and idealistic sentiment were not decoration, but the intent itself.
Hegemony is a rare ambition, Draudilan noted.
Rarer still is it realized. We do not mean to discourage you, but, even when it is achieved, the world has a way of visiting ruin upon it not long after.
That may be the case, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin replied, but, come what may, we shall carry out our sovereign's will.